Excellent. Well, welcome to DMP 888, Globalization, Cooperation in the Food Trade. This course is, I think, the only course I teach that actually has a course textbook. And I would encourage you to go into the syllabus to get the details on the course textbook. I do record all sessions, and you can find all the content for the course through the homepage under modules. And the syllabus, you can go in there and check that out. That has an overview of the learning objectives of the course, as well as the course text and how to get it. Has the ISBN number. You can purchase it. I've been teaching this class long enough now, you can probably get cheap copies on Amazon. But I also want to bring up here the course schedule. And this is something that you should check probably on a weekly basis. I will update and change this file if there are any changes. But I just want to note, especially for those of you there in Olathe today, that I am there physically next week. So we'll have class every week listed in the schedule by Zoom or me being there physically. And I will continue to record all sessions and upload those generally 1 to 2 days afterwards. Those of you watching this on video, if you live anywhere close to the Kansas City metro area and you want to crash and come to the Olathe-based classroom there in room 121, you're certainly welcome to do that on any of the days. If you are based in Manhattan or someplace close to Manhattan and you want to ride over with me on the asterisked days, I do take students over to the K-State Olathe campus, and it would be a day-long trip for you, but it's a great chance to see the campus there. And isn't it a wonderful campus, Andy?
Yes, it's very nice.
Yes.
Sometimes we mow the grass.
Pardon me?
Sometimes we mow the grass.
Yeah, sometimes we mow the grass, exactly. And so anyways, but you know, this is a class that was designed originally to be online. And so because of that, there's a number of reasons why it's totally fine for you, even those of you there at Olathe, if you can't make class one day, you can just watch the recording later. So any questions about the course schedule or venue related issues? I do suspect we'll have people logging in through Zoom in different weeks, but it looks like today we just have those of you zooming in from Olathe. And I'll see you next week in the flesh. Okay. Well, for today's inaugural module for the course, I want to give kind of a basic political science and agricultural security set of definitions regarding globalization, which of course is the first word in the title of the class. So this course is globalization, okay? And I want to unpack what we mean by that term globalization, because it is a term that's kind of tossed around, but I think it's helpful to have a technical understanding of what it really means, how it relates to the food system. And then we're going to look at another term, which Dr. Jason Ackelson, my co-director in the Frontier program, and I kind of coined, and that's called the Food and Agriculture Security Dilemma. And so we'll look at that definition, and then we'll actually look at models of cross-border cooperation, some of which we'll look at in more detail later on in the course. I was just going to say that, you know, just as the word globalization appears in the course title, cooperation also appears. And when we say cooperation, we're usually meaning cross-border cooperation and the specific models that we'll talk about today and in later modules. So, globalization, what is it? Those of you zooming in are tasting what is possible in the world of the information age, and the information age has definitely accelerated globalization. So globalization includes the sort of omnipresent availability of web-based services, products, commerce, but also physical commodities, people, animals, plants being traded on an ever increasingly frequent basis. And this definition here, I think, captures very well what we're talking about, and it captures the food trade. So globalization is the integration of financial, information, trade, and social networks to create a high-speed global marketplace. And we've always had a high-speed marketplace, I think, since probably the 1980s, 1990s, domestically in the United States. So for instance, many cities, over half now of the United States population is based in urban areas. And depending on whose figures you look at, because of the high-speed delivery of food into these municipal or these large metropolitan areas, there may only be 4 or 5 days worth of food at any given time. And they're relying on high-speed delivery, just-in-time delivery of products. Well, that phenomenon isn't just domestically in the US, that's worldwide. So it's possible, for instance, I've taken students on field trips to observe seafood operations in Massachusetts that import very quickly seafood that is harvested in the North Atlantic and the Pacific, brought in by ship and airplane to Gloucester, Massachusetts, and then processed very quickly. That one plant that we visited in Massachusetts supplies all of the fish fillets for McDonald's east of the Mississippi River. And it is an ongoing, seemingly never-ending, high-speed trade, import trade of seafood. And all of this has heightened the stakes. We have become more and more dependent upon imports as well as exports. And that's what we're talking about when it comes to globalization and the food trade. Well, digging in a little bit deeper here, let's look at some other illustrations of this. I have here 4 images of ports in the United States through which we import food of some kind. So in the upper left-hand corner is an image of the Port of Baltimore, and we import, amongst other things, seafood and a lot of processed products and a lot of ingredients that are then used in processed food products. And these come from over 100 different countries. In the upper right-hand corner, we have a sign from Santa Teresa, New Mexico, and that same port is pictured in the lower left. Santa Teresa is a major port of entry for fresh produce from Mexico, but not just fresh produce, not just tomatoes and chili and onions and avocados and all the glories of Mexican, sort of Tex-Mex fare, as it were, but also we import a lot of beef cattle. Over 1 million head of cattle come through a crossing not too far from the image in the lower left. And these cattle are trucked in a matter of days to, or even hours, to about 7 different states in the US, including Kansas. And then we process, we feed those animals, we process them, slaughter them, and then export a good portion of that back to Mexico, principally to Mexico City, which is a 21 million person city now, and very dependent upon imports, that just-in-time delivery that I was talking about. In the lower right-hand corner, we have an image of the Port of New Orleans. This is another destination where we've taken students before. And the Port of New Orleans is the #1 import node for coffee in the United States. So if you had coffee today, there's a pretty good chance that you consumed a product that was brought through this particular port, especially if you drank Dunkin' Donuts or Folgers coffee. So anyone, maybe raise your hands if you had any coffee like that. All right, good. So Andy has been metaphorically to New Orleans today. Okay, well, this now leads us to this term, the food and agriculture security dilemma. If we are increasingly and even inextricably linked to the global marketplace, then the United States has become accustomed economically and socially to importing animals, plants, food products, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say of all the commodities that we import, we're probably mostly dependent upon, we're dependent upon all the ones I've mentioned, certainly coffee, but seafood is a particularly important one. And I'll touch on that later on in the semester. But our security as a country is in some ways dependent upon those ongoing imports of food. Security is a term that we oftentimes think of in terms of, the military or Jack Bauer or CIA or Homeland Security or terrorism or counterterrorism. But security is actually a broader concept, and it involves many things, including preserving the so-called American way of life. You'll oftentimes hear the U.S. government refer to Homeland Security being all about the American way of life. Certainly a terrorist attack, say a radiological dirty bomb attack that would occur in the United States, that would significantly disrupt the U.S. way of life. They recently, there was the Boston Marathon, and the security was very high, just trying to make sure there was not another attack like there was in, I think it was 2013. And, these kinds of incursions are not just issues of kind of highbrow security in the military, but actually it eats at our way of life. And taking that further, when it comes to importation of, say, agricultural and food products, we have become dependent, our way of life is dependent on this. I mean, those of you there at Olathe in the classroom, I don't know, where do you guys shop for food? What grocery stores in the Kansas City area?
Costco.
You're a sophisticated shopper. Okay, others?
Well, I go to Aldi and Price Chopper.
Okay, Heidi. Yep. Go ahead, sorry.
Walmart, I think.
Walmart, okay. And Hy-Vee and Price Chopper. Do you guys have Hen House in Kansas City still? Here in Manhattan, we have Dillon's, Hy-Vee, Walmart. But, those grocery stores, especially during the winter time, it's nice to be able to go there and get fresh fruits and vegetables. And the availability and even the comparatively low price compared to decades ago of fresh fruits and vegetables is something that economically and socially we have become dependent on. And so you could make the argument that we have actually become, our food security in a very, very broad sense depends on these imports, okay? So that's point A, is that these cross-border trade flows, including imports of food, help ensure our American way of life or food security. But on the other hand, a live cattle shipment coming into to New Mexico, or a shipment of soybeans from Brazil, or a seafood shipment from the Russian Federation, or plums from Chile. These products can also carry pathogens and pests and disease. And that's point B. Imports, while we value them, can also represent a kind of security threat, safety and security threat, whether that's food safety related, animal health related, or plant health related. And so that's the dilemma. And I will ask you at the end of the semester in your oral exams, you'll all get to have a 20-minute oral exam with me at the end of the semester, and I will have a question about the food and agriculture security dilemma. And this is really a key sort of principle and concept to own as you guys go through the class. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Is the food security only related with like potential pathogen threat, or also the disruption of the chain could be a possible threat? Because when you build a food system related on imports, if those imports and roads are disrupted, then you have a security threat, right?
Yes, and that's a really good point. And what is your name?
Kostas.
Kostas? So Kostas, I think that you hit on a very important issue, and that is that the term food security includes a constellation of factors. Probably the most important factor is access to food, and the second one would be access to nutritious food. Okay, much of the work in food security, say for example in places like sub-Saharan Africa, have all been about food access. Many of the, and I think Kostas, you work with Eleni, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're familiar with the urban, sort of agriculture challenges, right? And part of that is an issue of food security, providing access and nutritious food. But it also needs to be safe, it needs to be high quality, it needs to be not tampered with, etc. So you make a good point. There are other issues besides just pathogens and pests and disease. So good point. One of the examples of this dilemma that you'll get to read about in the Module 1 section of the course, and you'll see a PDF of this, is an article from the Financial Times. And it talks about the U.S. dilemma of whether or not we should import pistachios from Iran. So I'm actually eating today. Can you guys see this? I'm eating raw almonds, pecans, and pistachios. Where do you think these pistachios were produced, Josh?
I don't know. Who's the biggest pistachio importer in the U.S.?
Just name the state.
I don't know.
California.
California, yep. So California has a massive pistachio industry. And as you'll read, and I have a question in the quiz for this module on it, as you'll read, you'll discover that people like maybe Simply Nature, these processors that put together packages of nuts, they would like to have a little more competition. They would be willing to use not just California pistachios, but maybe pistachios from other countries, maybe pistachios from Iran. Now, this article was written in January of 2016, before, this is when Obama was president. Now that Trump is president, trade politics have kind of gotten totally changed. But I hope when you read the article, you'll see the dilemma that relates to this economic desire to import pistachios with the concern about a particular health issue, and that is the presence of aflatoxins in these pistachios. So anyways, it's an illustration. You'll have an opportunity to read that and to answer a question or two in the quiz about that. But it really illustrates very well the dilemma that we face. You know, we may want to import pistachios, but on the other hand, you know, we don't want to import contaminated, aflatoxin contaminated pistachios. Okay, moving on. Sometimes people will tell you that globalization has really is really a recent phenomenon, you know, with, say, the internet or the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And by the way, if you're interested in the World Trade Organization, I teach another course that focuses on international law as it relates to the food system and the WTO. And so if you're interested in that, I do teach a course on that. And we'll kind of touch on some of those WTO-related issues. But the WTO was founded in 1995, and its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was founded in the 1940s. And some will say that globalization has really taken off since then. But I would say that globalization is something that's been going on for well over a century and a half. And to illustrate this principle, I want to take you through a little bit of history, and this will be a good background for the course text, because you guys will get to read some narratives on trade disputes that happened in the 1800s that involved the United States and Britain. Most of those disputes that you'll read about occurred in the 1870s and 1880s. But if you were to go back even further to the 1830s, you see kind of an economic backdrop that will help kind of paint a picture of why globalization is not new. It's been around. So just to hit the highlights here, in the 1830s and 1840s, there was a group, an activist political group in Britain called the Anti-Corn Law League. And the corn in Britain is a term that is frequently used for wheat. So they were talking about legislation related to wheat. And the corn laws were basically protectionist tariffs keeping out foreign wheat, foreign corn. It was the corn laws, okay? And what this did was it protected the British domestic farmers, including the politically influential landed gentry and the like. But the Anti-Corn Law League in the 1830s and 1840s, and keep in mind, this is during the Industrial Revolution. So if you guys had to read, for instance, cases of, like in maybe, I don't know, 8th grade literature class, read about Oliver Twist or any books by Charles Dickens, that's occurring during this era, basically. And the urbanization phenomenon that Dickens writes about was a real phenomenon. You had more and more people living in cities, more and more people working in manufacturing and industry, and it was in the economic interest of an increasing percentage of the British population to have cheaper wheat, cheaper food, okay? So the Anti-Corn Law League took hold of this, and they argued for the repeal of the corn laws. And they basically said, let's start importing foreign sources of food. Well, of course, this upset many of the domestic producers in Britain, but eventually their argument won out. And here's how it happened. You may remember from history classes the potato famine in Ireland. At the time, a lot of Ireland was part of the British Empire, and a lot of food that was that Britain had become dependent upon was produced in Ireland. Well, there were poor yields in England and Wales and Scotland and even in Ireland, and even the potato famine there. And there was basically a food shortage that became increasingly pronounced. And so in 1845, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Sir Robert Peel, I find it kind of poetic that his last name was Peel, like peel a potato. But Peel agreed with the Anti-Corn Law League, and he repealed the corn laws, okay? And not just tariffs on wheat imports, but also livestock imports from continental Europe, and then later, as you'll read, from places like Canada and the United States. And indeed, by the 1860s, imports of wheat and bacon and other cured pork products and even livestock, including cattle and hogs and sheep, started to take off in the 1860s. And this was because of a policy change designed to deal with the British way of life in a way, because in an increasingly industrialized, urban society, there was a need for cheaper food. Okay, well, fast forwarding back to modern day, cross-border cooperation is needed because of the food and agriculture security dilemma, right? We want to import food. It may be in the economic interests of processors and consumers and whatnot, shoppers at Hy-Vee, like Costas, but we want to make sure that those products are not contaminated, that they're safe, that they are equivalent to US safety standards, amongst other things. And so we have different ways that we do this. It is not true that we simply inspect things at the border. If that was the case, we would be very vulnerable because we can only inspect maybe 1 to 2% of all products imported. So there's got to be another way that we can facilitate trade and deal with the two components of the food and agriculture security dilemma. And I want to hit on 4 particular models that we will from time to time reference in the course and that you'll get to see in action in the course textbook. But first, a little bit of background. Many of these models of cross-border cooperation are governmental policies or business practices. And a policy is simply a plan or course of action intended to create some sort of objective. You can have formal and informal policies. So Andy, for instance, works at K-State Olathe. Andy, you probably are familiar with lots of different kinds of building policies, things that we're supposed to do in the building under certain situations. Some of you, maybe you, Josh, may end up working in, I don't know, a government agency someday. If you don't want to work for a government agency, that's okay. But you might someday be responsible for crafting a policy for what an agency does in the area of risk communication. So if you were to work at the, I don't know, the FDA or the USDA. Here in Manhattan, we have a new security policy related to handguns. So these are all kinds of examples, but you can also have individual personal policies. So maybe a good policy for individuals is honesty. You know, I'm going to be an honest person. And so policies are formal or informal. Well, trade policies are, in some cases, very, very uniquely suited to facilitate what we call cross-border cooperation. Okay? Let's look at some examples. One example of cross-border cooperation we see in a law that was passed by Congress in 2002, shortly after 9/11. That's the Bioterrorism Act. In the Bioterrorism Act, we have different regulatory provisions that basically encourage those exporting food to the United States to alert us ahead of time. And it's an attempt to facilitate cooperation, okay? That set of regulatory features and that law itself was not just brought up willy-nilly by some really intelligent senators and representatives. It was based on research conducted at the Congressional Research Service. And I might note that if you're ever needing to look at policy analysis of any kind, really related to any issue, Google the Congressional Research Service reports, CRS. They are some of the best writing you'll ever find in the United States. Highly intelligent, competent, multidisciplinary-minded policy analysts at the CRS put out reports at the request of Congress, and they're usually leaked to the web. It's not bad leak, it's just their main customer is Congress and not us. But you can access those through an open CRS website. It's a great place to go to get insight on the importance of policy issues, including cross-border cooperation. By the way, are any of you going to Washington, D.C. in the next couple of years? Maybe some of you watching on video might. I would encourage you, if you ever do go to Washington, D.C., if you really want to learn about how policies are crafted in the federal government, there's a relatively new Capitol Visitor Center in the U.S. Capitol basement area. And they have what I think to be probably the best video presentation of the political science phenomenon, e pluribus unum, which is the mantra for Congress in our representative democracy. So you might just check that out. Here's a picture of where the Capitol Visitor Center is. It's on the east side of the Capitol, underneath the basement. Okay. Models of cross-border cooperation are the devil's in the details. We see a lot of detail in regulations that are drafted as secondary extensions of primary policies adopted by Congress, for instance. So regulatory secondary regulations would include policies that the FDA or the USDA or the U.S. Department of Homeland Security create, and these are published in the Federal Register and then collected in the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay. Cross-border cooperation is a challenge because you have to have policymakers, that is the government, which we call the state, but also private actors who are involved in the market. So international trade, for instance, of seafood from Russia into Massachusetts, or live cattle from Mexico into New Mexico, or coffee through the port of New Orleans. You have to have the governments involved because trade occurs government to government. You have to have an articulation agreement between the state entities, the governmental policies and all that. But you also, of course, have to have the producers, the ranchers, the consumers, the distributors, the brokers, the wholesalers. All these people are private actors. So this is key for understanding trade and interpreting the challenges of cross-border cooperation. You have to have the state involved as well as the market. And to make things even more complicated, there are rules which we'll touch on a little bit in this course and that I go into in depth in my other class, DMP 816, that are enshrined in law at the WTO. That's in Geneva, Switzerland. So what we're talking about this semester is not easy. It's complex. It involves the state and the market. Okay. Let's talk about, just quickly hit the highlights of 4 distinct models that you may see in cross-border cooperation. One is something called regionalization. This is something that you'll get to read about that I argue was done in the 19th century by the United States, although unsuccessfully in the trade dispute that you'll get to read about in the course textbook. There was a trade dispute over contagious bovine pneumonia, an animal disease that was of concern to Great Britain. We were exporting live cattle to Great Britain at the time. And there was an argument made that these red shaded counties, this is a map from 1881, were indeed contaminated, but all the other counties were free of contagious bovine pneumonia. There was a distinction argument being made. We have diseased areas and disease-free areas. That is a term that, fast forward, is now enshrined in international law at the WTO and at the World Organization for Animal Health in Paris, and that is a term called regionalization. We use this with Mexico. We import cattle from the Mexican state of Chihuahua because Chihuahua is regionalized according to international law. We are happy to import cattle from Chihuahua because we consider it disease-free, but not from, say, southern Mexico, where we have diseased animals. So regionalization is one model of cross-border cooperation. Another model is compartmentalization. This is where vertically integrated supply chains, say, for example, a poultry operation in Arkansas, where they have good biosecurity controls over the flocks and the actual facilities where poultry are processed, and then the transportation and distribution systems. If you can ensure the biosecurity of an actual supply chain, according to international law, you can actually manage, or you can be treated differently than the entire nation state. So compartmentalization is strategically helpful, especially for large countries like the United States, because without regionalization or compartmentalization, if there's an outbreak, say, of avian influenza in California, someone in Arkansas cannot export because the whole country is considered diseased. But with regionalization or compartmentalization, we can isolate these so-called disease-free areas, and they can be certified to continue to trade. And you can see how this helps deal with the food and agriculture security dilemma going the other way. Countries that want, for instance, to import poultry from the US would be able to continue to import poultry from the US in a state where, like Arkansas, you might have compartmentalization going on, even if there was an outbreak, say, in Western or in California. So that's the second model. Another model that you'll get to read about in historical context is something called regulatory coordination. This is where governments actually take the time to not simply inspect each other's goods, but they write and harmonize their regulations and laws so that they have more confidence that what is being produced in another country is compliant with, say, the importing country. And regulatory coordination, I would argue, is probably the most primitive, meaning the first one that we've seen in the history of international trade, and you'll read about it in the course text. Finally, from a social justice standpoint, this is something that I used to be involved in when I worked at the World Trade Organization in Geneva many years ago. We would try to help so-called poorer countries that maybe don't have the scientific or legal horsepower to better improve their food safety regulations or their kind of biosecurity capacity, so that they are exporting safe and secure products. And that's an effort that we call technical assistance and capacity building. And that's really important, actually, for globalization writ large, because we don't want to have, from a social justice standpoint, just rich countries trading with rich countries. It's important as a matter of principle to be able to have trade going on with all countries. There's quite a bit of evidence that the more countries trade with one another, the less likely they are to have conflict, military conflict. So, all right, well, I'm going to stop there. Any questions?
I have one.
Yeah, Josh?
So you might hit on this later in the course, but I was kind of curious, what is the schedule for trade policy revision in the United States? I know you'd mentioned there's pretty significant changes between Obama's presidency and Trump's presidency.
Yeah.
And I don't know if trade policy has seen a revision like that, that drastic of a change. Is there anything policy-wise, like a schedule of revision in the United States, or how does that work?
Well, we're about to find out about NAFTA. I mean, it looks like it has all but been declared that we're going to be maybe getting out of NAFTA. I think the big problem is are things being renegotiated while the current systems are in operation? That's the question. And honestly, it's been very, it was interesting. So we have a multilateral global trading system with probably 170 members in the World Trade Organization and the WTO. And that system, which I consider to be most important, includes a trade agreement called the SPS agreement, or the Agreement on the Application of Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures. And that's what I cover in depth in my other class, DMP 816. I have not heard that the Trump administration's looking to renegotiate, the WTO agreements. Although, and do not interpret this as political commentary, but anything is possible with the current administration. If we've learned anything, that's the case. But NAFTA is very, there's a lot of agricultural stakeholders in the United States that are very keen on what happens with NAFTA. And so it remains to be seen. So I will have a video of this published in probably the next day or two. And I know Kostas, I see you when I go to my office. I know Josh, I know Andy, and you in the back left, what's your name?
It's Michael.
Michael. And are you a longtime Kansan?
Yes, sir. Born and raised.
All right. Kansas City or?
Kansas City, Kansas. Wyandotte County.
All right. Very good. Well, go ahead.
I was just I'm a new master's student in food science.
Very good. Awesome. Well, I will see you all personally next week, and thank you for coming to class today.
Thank you.